It's time. This is Paul. The big video that a number of us have been waiting for a while has dropped. It dropped on one of my busiest weeks of the year. So hence the little phone video I did. I might be continuing to play with other shorts. I was tempted to play with a 1-minute short. This one will not be short, but it's limited to the amount of time I have today to devote to this video. I doubt I can get through the whole thing today. My goal would be to maybe get through half of it today and half of it tomorrow. I am taking Thursday and Friday off. I will not be making videos Thursday, Friday, Saturday, or Sunday. There will be a Thursday Thanksgiving meditation on the channel, but there might not be anything posted during the weekend. So fair warning. Now, as I mentioned in the video I dropped yesterday, Jordan clearly has some production peeps, and the production peeps are quite well attuned to the conversation in this little corner of the internet. One of the big takeaways of this video was that, for me, was that if we are doing dialogos, if we are doing distributed cognition, reps in terms of conversations are vitally important. Last time I did the major commentary on Peterson's video, I did an entire hour plus of comments before the video, and a whole bunch of people were annoyed. So I'll give you some video, and then we'll do the comments. But first, they started with a teaser clip. First you had your little ad for, 12 more rules, and then continue the journey. So you had the little book ad, and, Peterson will probably be starting a book tour soon. But you had first little ad for the book, and then they had a teaser clip. And the teaser clip teased me. It teased me hard. Later, when I heard the portion that was in the teaser clip, within context, it was so much better. But it's like, hey, we Protestants and Catholics and Orthodox, we finally, after a number of centuries, stopped killing each other. Let's not start this fight again, shall we?
There's also something important, Jordan, in understanding that at least the traditional churches, at least the liturgical churches, that you don't them, like, for example, in the Orthodox Church, they always say, if the sermon is more than 15 minutes, it's pride. It's like,
ouch.
Keep your sermons as short as possible, because you're not there to encounter.
No, I'm obviously guilty of that.
You're
Jordan, seeing himself as a Protestant preacher, that is very much who Jordan Peterson is. And I think, there's all these, if people are betting if and when Jordan Peterson joins a church, which church he will join because of his wife, some people say Roman Catholic, and he loves the symbolism and, the vestments and all. Some people say Orthodox because of the Pageau connection, but I think he's deeply, deeply Protestant. I don't think there's, no. That doesn't make for good video. Let's keep going.
You're not there. I mean, it's propositional understanding is fine, but it's participatory, right? Church is participatory. So you enter into the church, like you imagine an Orthodox church, even a traditional Catholic church, you have a space which is structured as the hierarchy, ontological hierarchy of being. And then you see these images which are patterned and are revealing to you these mysteries that are beyond words. And then you participate in this singing, these processions, and it is a participative thing. And so if you go there to kind of get knowledge, it's not the same type of practice. And as you're singing these songs and as you're hearing these hymns, all of a sudden two images connect together. And all of a sudden, these things start to connect inside you in almost a kind of super rational way.
Now, again, when we get to this clip, and it's towards the end of the video, and this conversation really starts out slow, and that's not unusual for conversations where you haven't had people meet together and talk together and really get on the same page. But it will pick up speed as it goes along. There is the psychedelic thing. We are going to be dealing with the psychedelic thing for a long time. I can tell. It's I made that little video last night, and we're going to be dealing with this psychedelic thing for a long time. It's also interesting that the teaser highlights Pageau and this in Pageau. This is what he said. So that was very interesting too, because, you always have to sort of look at Jordan Peterson, and then you have to look at Jordan Peterson Incorporated, because right from the start, when Jordan Peterson's status rocket took off, he grabbed his family. His father was sorting through email, and his daughter was doing stuff, and his son, you'd see Julian coming in and fixing the mic and everything. And then, of course, he went on the crazy first, 12 Rules for Life book tour, which wasn't really a book tour. And, this other organization got involved, and he's got publishers involved and all of that. But Jordan Peterson Inc., in terms of the people he has around him working on this stuff, do have a hand in what's put out. Now, the relationship between Jordan and this, I have no idea about. If I had a staff, which I don't, except that I have a budding staff made up of a crazy guy who does saving throws for videos, and an alcoholic, and a former Canadian who has another symbolic world. That seems to be my staff. So this was a very interesting. Now, as Grail Country, as Nate Heil said on Twitter, I did think that the Vervaeke Sam conversation, their second conversation, was in some ways, especially for Nate, given who Nate is, he preferred that conversation to this one. But this, in time, will be important. One of the things that I've learned in doing these commentaries, especially the Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris one, is that my first reading or living with this talk for the first week or couple weeks or so, after a few weeks, after things continue to go, different resonances pick up. And that's because there's a lot of reasons for that. One of which is we don't see everything at once. The world is too rich. Even a video like this is too rich for us to take in the nuances. And so with repeated viewings or repeated listenings or something else reminds me of it, so I go back and listen to a segment. This video, it's alive in that sense, and it continues to change as we go. But again, starting out with this red meat clip that is intended to, get some, just stick it into a Protestant preacher like me, well.
And the insights you get, sometimes you have difficulty explaining them, but they're very deep, and they're embodied as you bow down, as you kneel, as you eat the body and blood of Christ. These are different types of participation than just.
And Jonathan, I'm totally in agreement with you. And what did we do in our Catholic churches in the West? The same time we were presenting the Bible in this flattened out historical critical way, we also were flattening out our churches, emptying out our churches of just that mystical cosmic symbolism, the angels, the saints, color, the cosmic dimension, and we flattened them out, and we made them like empty meeting spaces.
Now, Bishop Barron, in this conversation, is at a real disadvantage. One of the things I keep reminding people who want to, this is a favorite guy I listen to, and this is a favorite person I listen to, and we're going to get them together, and they're going to have a great conversation, and it almost always disappoints. Because, again, it takes a while if you're going to have the kinds of distributed cognition, the kind of dialogos that John Vervaeke is talking about, and we're going to talk about that, especially when we get to the end of the video, when Vervaeke mentions a name, which I did some digging on that name, because in a lot of ways, this is what Vervaeke has been doing. It doesn't go because it's first meetings. And again, these conversations, they kind of beget other conversations. Just because you have high status, really smart, articulate people, someone like Bishop Barron, doesn't mean he necessarily can sort of slide in and you can accomplish, now I'm doing fancy Vervaeke hands, sort of a dance and get that dialogos going. And, I mean, the last few conversations I've had with John Vervaeke have been really amazing. And, I certainly credit John for a lot of that, but a lot of it is, well, he's not only such a gracious conversation partner, but, we've gotten to know each other, we've gotten to trust each other, and you can just, you can just learn to dance. That's sort of the way it goes. So now we have the Peterson intro music here.
Have the opportunity to speak with,
And we know who they are.
interest specific personal professor at the University of Toronto, Bishop Barron, an Orthodox Christian leader and public speaker. I thought we'd see what we could all do together. So welcome, gentlemen. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And John,
Thank you very much.
yeah, John, I'll start with you. So I'm going to ask you two questions. I'm going to ask you what you think meaning means. What does the term mean? What does it signify? And then there's some implicit idea, I suppose, that meaning has different depths and that religious meaning is among the deepest of depths. And I'd like you to riff on that. We'll go from man to man to do that. Then we'll...
Now, just initially, who performed best in this conversation? If I had to rank them, it would be Vervaeke first, Pageau second, Peterson third, and Bishop Barron fourth. And the reason for that is Pageau and Vervaeke have done a fair amount of conversing back and forth, more than Pageau and Peterson have, more than Vervaeke and Peterson have, especially recently. And Bishop Barron is just not a regular in this. And it's not just how familiar or how many reps you've had with the individuals in terms of a conversation like this. It's also how much of their content you have seen. Now, lately, John Vervaeke has been putting out so much content, he's almost putting out more than I am, which, again, my project is a little different. I don't really think of myself as a content creator. I am trying to figure out how to use YouTube and you all as sort of a third lobe for distributed cognition. And I think John Vervaeke is doing more and more of that. The rate at which he's having conversations, posting them on his channel, posting them on other podcasts. Now Rebel Wisdom is interested in a bigger project in this. I mean, he's really putting out a lot of stuff. But John also watches a lot of stuff. And he'll regularly, he always says, I can't keep up with your stuff, and I certainly wouldn't expect him to. But he tries to watch and listen to the things that are salient to the places where especially we overlap. And I know he follows Jonathan, and I know Jonathan, obviously Jonathan, none of us can keep up with the amount of content that we are producing now, and especially in the little corner that's closest to me with Randos United and Grim Grizz and Nate Heil and all the different individuals and more coming online. I'm always getting emails and tweets from people who are doing videos or doing a little bit of commentary. And, one guy emailed me today and said, I think I should ask for permission to use the stuff. And Peterson taught us that. Peterson was like, no, use my stuff on YouTube. And, when you do that, you open yourself to critique or criticism, or even, Jordan's certainly been a lightning rod, but use the stuff. Use this stuff to think together. If you don't like it, how can I describe the, Pageau and Chad and Grimm. They're the chaotic, they're the chaos fringe of this little corner of the internet. But, Muppet me, just do whatever. It doesn't matter, because what we're doing is we're thinking together, and we'll all do the sifting as we go. So having said that about John's performance, where he begins, it's kind of hard to go first in a group like this because you're sort of out there. And he, their opening statements were all quite interesting and quite telling in terms of what they've done. So let's have John do his first.
We'll start talking as if it's a conversation.
Great. Thanks again for inviting.
It's also the case that in a conversation like this, Grim Grizz likes to talk about the fourth wall. Now, I know I regularly hear, Grim, you got to keep in the comments here because people keep asking, who's this Grim Grizz guy? So keep sticking your nose in there and keep putting your comments and keeping your links in there so people can find you. He does much shorter videos than I do, and he's very much at the chaotic, neutral side of orientation. In fact, he has a video on his own orientation in that way. It's a Grim Grizz orientation, not a different kind of orientation. But oh shoot, I just distracted myself. Okay, so there's a fifth party in this, and that's us. And when I first, so all the way back to the start of my channel, I was watching a lot of Jordan Peterson videos. I wanted in on the conversation. Jordan Peterson at that point already had, about 300,000 subs on his channel. And so I knew he was too far up a status hierarchy, and there wasn't going to be much chance to really engage personally. But in many ways, the individual matters, of course, but it's the ideas that I'm engaging with. And on this flat screen, we are engaging with them together. And so when I thought about the kinds of videos I wanted to do, there are other people doing little commentary videos and stuff. I wanted to watch the videos with you and give and share my thoughts on that. And of course, Twitch was out there and many other things were out there, but it is the fourth wall that I wanted to break down. Now, we're only doing that virtually because these four are talking to each other in real time, but that's one layer of this, and the other layer is they are doing a public performance as such. And I've done plenty of conversations in this, and those of you, sorry, not a lot of rando slots during the holidays, there'll be more during December, but those of you who have managed to grab a rando slot know I always tell you the same thing. Let's record it. There's sometimes reasons why we don't record it at all because it's just the nature of things. Let's record it, and then if you want a copy, I'll send you a copy. You can share with whom you want. But once we know that someone else is watching us, it changes. It's not a bad change. It's a realistic change. And you go out on YouTube and people are going to do whatever they want with it. And my channel's quite small. So, I don't have anywhere near the liability as especially Peterson, and in some ways Barron and Pageau and John as well. But there's this conversation is part performance and it's part conversation, and we're recording it. And so we are really exploring sort of a new way of creating community and, all John's fancy Vervaeke words, as Job calls them, distributed cognition and all of those things. So
me, and it's a great pleasure to be here. It's great to see you again, Jonathan, and it's a pleasure meeting you, Bishop. So there's a question, as you said quite correctly, that's at the center of a lot of my work and also, I guess, my own personal project. I take it when we're talking about meaning in this context, we're using meaning as a metaphor. We're talking about something similar to the way a sentence works. It has an intelligibility to it that connects us to the world in some important way so that we can interact with the world and so we can be informed by the world. And that what we're talking about when we're talking about meaning, when in the sense of meaning in life, not just the meaning of a sentence, the question to ask is, what is that metaphor pointing to? So I've put forth the proposal that what that metaphor is pointing to is something that's fundamental to our cognitive agency. And Jordan, this is something you and I have talked about before in other contexts, which is the problem of relevance realization, which is this deep, profound problem at the heart of cognitive science. You find at the heart of AI, many issues within cognitive psychology, categorization, communication. And this is, of all of the information available to me, how do I zero in on the relevant information? Of all of the information available in my long-term memory and all the potential ways I could combine them, how do I connect and zero in on the relevant information? Out of all the possible courses of actions I could undertake, the way I could sequence various things together, how do I select the appropriate sequence of actions? How do I do that? And the thing that's that's mysterious and wonderful and perplexing and intriguing and I'm obsessed about is we're doing it all right now, and we're doing it like this, and it's not a cold calculation.
Now, again, I ranked them in terms of how I thought they performed in this, and I ranked Vervaeke first, but he really, Chad the alcoholic is pretty open when he says, I don't understand anything that comes out of his mouth. And, I got to play Grim Grizz's appropriation of John.
I'm building an ecology of practices of group information processing and attention hyperfocusing towards constructing the best salience hierarchy beholder I can, with which I intend to steer the Overton window toward something terrible. Okay, forget that last part, but the first part.
Now, Grimm is a huge fan of John and his work, and but that's, and I could chattel off and say I just have difficulty understanding, and so, in all fairness to John, he tries to take 50 hours of Awakening from the Meaning Crisis and put it all into one video, and it was John who has brought forward the idea of the meaning crisis, which is just this real succinct way of framing a ton of things. And when I first heard John talk about the meaning crisis, a lot of Jordan stuff just fell into place. But it's very interesting because at the beginning of this video, a lot of people are just going to be like, what? It's meaning is a remarkably difficult thing to describe. Is it a feeling? Is it out in the world? Now, John will say it's the connection between us and the world. Meaning is in many ways between us and the world. It's also between us as human beings. And it's something that in some ways, it's not unlike what I talk about in terms of spirit. We generate it by our actions. Carl made a comment that, if I had read his first paper that he sent me a while ago, I would understand that the reason we have a meaning crisis is, and then he went into a series of political and economic things, which I completely agree is part of it. I can go faster and simply say the reason we have a meaning crisis is our success and affluence is certainly a contributor to the meaning crisis, but I think it goes far deeper, especially with endgame modernity. And I know as I get more consistent and more articulate in terms of talking about the recession of modernity and the end of modernity, many people who are deeply committed to modernity, whether or not they know it, will get increasingly uncomfortable about the kinds of things that we're talking about. And I've already begun to see some of that aimed at Pageau, although for myself and Pageau and Bishop Barron, once you're used to dealing in a religious community, you're used to taking shots. That's part of, at the beginning of, it was the Christopher Nolan Batman series. I mean, the Batman origin story, many of these origin stories are like that. Dune is sort of like this, where you come out of this absolutely brutal, harsh environment. And so if you're in any way a Christian leader and have been around Christian communities, it's like that pit that they have at Batman, where you're just gonna get people coming at you from all sides doing things. And so it toughens you up. But the end of modernity is, in many ways, we have looked around the world, we have found ourselves alone, and we're the only agents here. And then suddenly we look in the mirror and we wonder about ourselves, because we've been looking at that and doing it. Well, you're just the sum of your psychology and your sociology and your genetics. There's no little person in there. You're just the product of the whole show, as C.S. Lewis talks about in his book Miracles. You're just a product of the whole show. Well, then I'm just a product of the whole show. Then nothing matters. And right there you are at your meaning crisis. So I think John will probably want to, and Christopher Mastropietro is an excellent resource for John, because Christopher is just really good at just getting these little, and as a preacher, a lot of the explanation just right over people's heads. It's the stories, it's the images, it's the illustrations. As a preacher, I know people very quickly forget almost all of my theological points expressed in abstraction. But tell them a story, give them an image, give them an illustration. You repeat an illustration in a sermon, people will say, you said that last week. You repeat an abstraction in a sermon and nobody remembers it.
You know, I'm standing out, I'm salient. There's an element of arousal, there's affect. You're caring about some information and you're backgrounding and ignoring other information. So it's this very affectively laden connectedness. Because the idea of relevance realization is it's not, relevance isn't in the head, it isn't in the world, it's in a proper, real relation.
And you see Jonathan nodding because Jonathan's done the reps with John. He's heard this many times. I've heard this many times. And so now, and I regularly have this with John's work, it takes me a long time to really have this stuff sink in. And the same with Jonathan's work. I think it's the truth with almost anyone. So Jordan is, how familiar is Jordan with John's work? I don't know. Is Bishop Barron at all familiar with John's work? Probably not at all. But Bishop Barron is, and he's highly adept and experienced at this kind of thing. So he will take in what he can, but it's just tremendously difficult to contextualize and understand this.
Between the embodied brain and the world, this is what's known as embodied cognition. This is the kind of cognitive science I am involved in. So the idea is this is a dynamical self-organizing process, and you can feel it a little bit at work right now as I'm talking. Part of your attention wants to drift away and think about other things. Right? This is like variation and evolution. Another part of your attention is focusing in and selecting, and you're constantly varying and selecting, and you're evolving in this dynamically coupled fashion, a salience landscape that makes you feel that you're here now in this particular state of consciousness, in this situational awareness. So you're deeply fundamentally connected, and that is
and there's just so much information going that, and what you really need is the information having a flow and coming to a point. And again, narrative does that. Narrative does that so well. Narrative is this enormous compression engine that grips us so deeply that we can communicate so often so much more than we even know, sometimes to our detriment. But
deeply central to your cognitive agency. If you don't have that, you're not a cognitive agent. And this is, of course, one of the things that has the whole project of artificial intelligence has disclosed. We thought that intelligence was mostly about propositional manipulation, right? Getting, sort of coherence. And instead, no, this dynamical, embodied, evolving connectedness is very central to our cognitive agency. So much so that it stands to good reason that it is a core motivational feature and dimension of our whole agency. So I talk about meaning in life, and I use the word, and I use it deliberately, but I hope it's not offensively. I use the word religio to describe this connection, because that's the meaning of religio, to bind together. It's one of the purported etymological origins of the word religion. And that allows me to now segue into what I would want to say religious meaning is. So I think when we are, here's a metaphor, and I often use this. A lot of the time, our mental framing is transparent to us, like my glasses. We're looking through it and by means of it. But there are times
I think this illustration works well.
When I need to step back and consider. This is what you do in mindfulness practices. I need to consider that mental framing. Mm-hmm. And I might want to not only consider it, I might want to educate it. I might want to celebrate it. So normally religio is transparent to us, and therefore it affords our agency. But there are things we do where we step back and we try to become more directly aware of religio in order to educate it, perhaps correct it, improve it, celebrate it. And when we're doing that in a way that creates what I call a reciprocal opening, the opposite of what happens in addiction. Reciprocal opening is my agency is opening up.
This is so much of Awakening from the Meaning Crisis is just right in this little talk.
The world is opening up, and I'm experiencing this inexhaustible fount of emerging intelligibility that's not just conceptual, but is this about this religio. For me, that's the experience of sacredness. And so when religio, when we focus upon religio rather than focus through it, in order to accentuate it and accelerate it, so that we can come into the deepest mutual resonance between ourselves and the depths of reality, that for me is what religious meaning would be. The religio about the sacred. So that would be my initial answer. I hope that was helpful.
Okay, so I'm going to comment on that, and I'll make my comments about this question because I'm also a psychologist, and then we'll move to you guys, to Jonathan and to Bishop Barron.
Now, you just listened to John Vervaeke's comments, and I think probably many of you are just kind of lost, unless you've listened to Awakening from the Meaning Crisis 2 or 3 times. You've gotten very familiar with a lot of John's terms. And even then, if I had to sort of, I even considered just skipping this whole first part of the video and commentary, because it's difficult commenting on that unless I sort of would take it 5 or 10, a phrase at a time, and it's just so compact. But now watch what Peterson does with the same question. Well, he doesn't really engage with much of what John says here. But, I mean, part of the reason Peterson is so skilled as a Protestant preacher, as a public communicator, why his book tour and his biblical series were so much like Protestant revival meetings in some ways. You know, they weren't the pageantry that the little teaser clip of Pageau talked about. Is watch what he does here, because this is quintessential Peterson, and he was in this conversation, at least for the first while, about as sharp, and we're seeing more of the old Jordan Peterson back, and it's really good to see.
So, if you think when you look at the world, there's a central point of focus, and that's mediated by your fovea, and that's at the back of that's on your retina in the center, essentially.
Now, he almost immediately goes to something which is a little bit more than we know, because we kind of know that there's this area in it's the fovea. I've heard that before. Peterson is very skilled at sounding clinical. He's a clinical psychologist. I'm not a prophet. I'm a clinical psychologist. He's a clinical psychologist. And so this, in terms of our culture, is deeply resonant because of the trust, credibility that we see in this sort of medicalized field. And so he leverages the credibility of medical science in his answer, but he's also doing it in a very personal way. This really is a rather little remarkable piece that he gives us here.
And you notice that when you zoom your eyes on something, that becomes very clear. It's a very small area that becomes very clear. And then you'll notice that around that area, it's less and less and less clear until it fades out into nothingness. And the nothingness you don't even perceive. It's just not there. And so it's high resolution in the center, lower, 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 lower. Way out here in the periphery, you actually don't even see color. You can't tell that, but you don't. And you're better at detecting motion, because maybe you should look at moving things. And then the world.
And again, this is just way Peterson talks. Now, also pay attention in terms of rhetorically now. He's going to just try to make a few points, but the points are going to have sort of a hierarchy. They pull all the other points with them, and then they pull all the other points, or at least a a descending number of points then into us. Some of us who are most familiar will be able to grab most of it, but again, it's much more of a one-pointed thing. And again, when you teach preaching, something that I fail at regularly, but when you teach preaching, one of the things, a couple of little tidbits that we tell people who are aspiring to learn preaching: most sermons fail because of too many points, too many disconnected points. What you want is one point, and everything else is connected to that point. And ideally, there are metaphors and images that hold the whole thing together. And in that way, you can sort of, really focus. And what he's sort of done with this illustration is, in fact, embody the way he's talking even in this illustration.
Vanishes. So, and that's sort of that's very much like what consciousness is. Mm-hmm. And also it's associated with meaning, because you focus your fovea on what's most meaningful. And those foveal cells are tremendously connected into the visual cortex.
And again, notice the scientific connection, the medical connection. That gives him authority when you mention physicality, as opposed to something abstract, which to us, especially after years of modernity and materialism, make it suspect.
It takes a lot of brain to make that fovea work, and that's why it's such a small area, and we move it around instead of just having a retina that's all fovea. We'd have to have a brain like this big to manage that. So, and
again, watch just the imagery. He's just an amazing speaker. He really is.
That's sort of like a metaphor for consciousness and meaning. And then I want to layer something on top of that metaphor. And this is something like the relationship between...
right there is a good transition. Again, homiletics is the study of preaching. If this were a sermon and I would critique him, I would say that's an effective transition.
Conscious and the unconscious, and also the relationship between narratives and consciousness and unconsciousness. So I'm looking at, say, John right now. I'm looking at his eyes, because that's what you do when you converse with someone. And I'm doing that because we're having a conversation. And so I have this little frame of reference that helps me realize what's relevant right now. My goal is...
Now, he's just brought in some of... Because if you Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, relevance realization is a key piece of John Vervaeke's system. And Jordan, let's bring that in here.
Have an interesting conversation. And I'm picking out the targets that I presume are relevant to that goal. Mm-hmm. But then you might ask yourself, well, why that goal? And then, so that story that's guiding me is nested in a larger story, which is, well, maybe I'm an educator and a communicator, and I'd like to bring this knowledge to myself, but also to other people. Mm-hmm. And then outside of that is another story, which is, well, why am I doing that? And well, it's because...
Now notice how he's been connecting everything all the way through. It's not this. It's one thing. It's sort of got a narrative thread that's running through it. This is really good rhetoric.
I think that it's an interesting thing to do, and it's a meaningful and useful thing to do, but it'll help educate people, and maybe that'll make the world a slightly better place in some manner. And then outside of that, there's another presumption, which is, well, why would I bother trying to make the world a better place? And maybe that's because not suffering is better than suffering, and because I think that that's a moral way to act, and I would like to act in a moral manner. And then outside of that, there's yet another story, which is, well, and that's where you start to shade into the religious. It's like, who exactly am I imitating when I enact that morality? And I think that's where we can have a particularly interesting discussion, because
Now, after watching Peterson for 4 years plus now, what's his contribution? In many ways, his contribution is giving people a sense of credibility about the relationship between religion, which in a materialistic culture feels abstract and tenuous, and our biology.
I would say psychologically that implicit figure at the outer edge of the narrative structuring of my consciousness and meaning realization, that would be something that's psychologically equivalent to the hero of heroes. In some sense, that would be culture free, but in our culture, in the Judeo-Christian culture, that figure is Christ.
So he just had a little nod to pluralism, which is something that people are deeply anxious about. You heard that come into the question and answer for Jonathan's presentation on Genesis. So we're always deeply concerned about diversity and pluralism and the world and Christianity. Well, that's our thing here. And Jordan sort of incorporates that anxiety and sort of puts people to rest and says, but for us, that's Christianity.
And so then this is independent of religious belief as far as I'm concerned.
And there you've got his anxiety about propositional belief, dogma, some of these things, that the kinds of confessional fights that have gone on between religions that people look at and say, oh, you have the truth and you have the truth and you have the truth, but none of you agree with each other. Why should I agree with any of you? So he sort of deals with that very quickly and succinctly.
Now, there's an interesting relationship with formal religious belief, but I think this is the way it works psychologically. And I got some of this from studying neuroscience, the same sorts of things John is studying, but some of it from studying Jung. And, Jung proposed that at the very least, speaking psychologically, Christ is the symbol of the self. And what he meant by that is that Christ is the symbolic realization of our culture's determination of the embodiment of the ideal. And it's an image, and it grips us. It's the thing we imitate or we fight against. We're in that whether we like it or not. And then
again, classic Peterson, using emotion, using his body, using that physically. In many ways, this is where he and Pageau meet, because not only do you have a sense of, not only is he talking at us, but he is giving us structure, he is giving us image, he is really using some of the stuff like this where, okay, and when Pageau used these kinds of diagrams, Peterson used similar diagrams in maps of meaning. And so following on this, he's seeing all these structures, both high resolution and low resolution, and in a very short amount of time, he's putting things together. Now, for those who have listened to a lot of Peterson, there's a lot of repetition in here, but repetition isn't necessarily a bad thing, because with each pass over something that is quite complex, you not only get the basic structure, but you're able to sort of fill in the little details. And so that is what Jordan is doing here. And that's part of the reason he's able to be listened to again and again and again, because there's a fair amount of complexity to what he's giving you. And so every time you hear it, your resolution goes up, your resolution goes up. And as your resolution goes up, you're continued to be satisfied, because there's still little micro novel areas that was given to you before, but it sort of passed over. You weren't able to grip it. The little alveoli in your, like in your small intestine, or weren't able to sort of capture those little things. And now you capture it. So you hear it again and again and again, and your resolution goes up, and you can gain more of it. And your ability to yourself re-represent what he says begins to come through.
The question becomes for me, okay, well, that's a psychological truth, but it can also be a metaphysical claim and an ontological.
See, and now he could have said metaphysical truth, and people wouldn't like that. And a little bit later in the conversation, he says, I go to a Protestant church, and they just tell me all these things that I should believe, and don't tell me what I believe. A little later, Bishop Barron says, well, beauty is, of the transcendentals, beauty is many ways the most winsome, because truth, it's, we bristle, and goodness, someone's sticking their morality down my throat. So his choice of claim there is, for our culture, much more, well, it's a claim. I'm not saying it is. I'm saying it's asserted by someone. And if it's asserted by someone, it's not so say we all. You can take it or leave it. It's a claim. So, I mean, this is why Peterson has moved has moved a mountain in the way that he has.
Claim, but it can also be a metaphysical claim and an ontological claim, and that's where this starts to shade into the religious per se. So that's it for me. So
that was quite brief. I mean, he did a lot very quickly, and a lot of that was very pleasing. You might not have captured everything he said, but you felt like he was sort of telling a story, and you got a little bit of medical stuff, and you got some psychology stuff, and there was some tantalizing, some teasing of religion in there. I mean, there's a lot of reason why Peterson has been so popular with this stuff. So now again, if you look at John's presentation, I think for many of you, if I'd ask you, okay, pop quiz, what did you capture from John's presentation? What did you capture from Jordan's presentation? And in terms of preaching stuff, one of the things that you also quickly learn is people don't remember what you said, but they remember how you made them feel. How did John make you feel? How did Jordan make you feel? And again, John's my friend. I'm giving this critique. And again, out of the entire conversation, all included, I thought John did the best of the four. But the intro, I think John, if he would probably be good to, okay, what do I mean by meaning? And then tell a story, and then another story that's adjacent, and then maybe a point or two, and then a concluding illustration, like with the glasses. And I think people would listen to that and they'd say, oh, now would they get everything that John wanted to give to us? No. But I don't think most people got everything John wanted to give to us anyway. And that's when you have the question of the audience. I mean, how much did Bishop Barron get? I don't know. He's far better educated than I am. He's, much better in philosophy than I am. But so again, I was tempted to kind of skip over the opening comments, but then I thought about it. I thought, no, actually, these opening comments sort of set the table for where this is going to go. And there's some instructive moments in these opening comments that are worth sort of taking a look at. Okay, so we've had a cognitive scientist and a clinical psychologist take a whack at this hard question.
Bishop, do you want to take it from there?
Now we get the bishop.
Yeah. Thank you. First of all, everybody, thank you. And Jonathan and John, to meet you for the first time, at least virtually. I've met Jordan twice now virtually, but good to be with all of you. You're all Canadians, right? All of you are Canadian born? Because all I can think of as you both were talking about
Here's a pastor. Well, how much local pastoring does he do in his position? I don't know, but this is a smooth pastoral move, okay? And pastors have lots of tricks that we do and that we use, and always lead with the personal. So here's an aspect that all three share personally and come in with, okay, let's talk about another Canadian.
Lonergan. I'll get maybe back to him, but one of my favorite philosophers, the Canadian Jesuit Lonergan, came to my mind a lot. But to answer the opening question, I guess I would say meaning is to be in a purposive relationship to a value. So
now that's it's really good. It's probably for him. So Barron's been around the block, and one of the things that we see with Barron in both of his conversations with Jordan Peterson and in this one are a lot of set answers. And you almost can't help that if you're actually working in a field a lot and always fielding the same questions. You get some pretty set answers, and they're your favorites, and they're how you it's how you'll go after things. But that's a really good answer, and it's very compact, it's very brief, it's just all right there.
I mean in my mind a lot. But to answer the opening question, I guess I would say meaning is to be in a purposive relationship to a value.
Purposive relationship to a value. It's a little abstract, but it's succinct.
So I think certain values appear, epistemic values of the true, moral values, and aesthetic values. So the true, the good, and the beautiful, right? The three transcendental properties of being. And I think those values appear. And I really like what you were saying, too, both of you, about attention. What gets our attention? What draws our consciousness? Why, like...
I suspect when he said this, I suspect he watched the Pageau Peterson video. He can't have much time to watch a lot, and probably almost none of Vervaeke. And the Vervaeke Peterson video was so unusual, it would be tough to get a lot out of it without really sitting down with it. But also notice rhetorically what he did. Here's the statement, and now he's going to articulate it. It's very easy for the listener to sort of follow.
William James says the mind is like a bird that flies, and it perches for a time, it looks, and then it flies again.
And he's able to name drop, a pragmatist, which of course all of Jordan Peterson, it's a pragmatist. And a nice little illustration, nice little word picture. He's very good at what he does.
Why does it focus on certain things? And we'd call those values, I would say. And a meaningful life is one that's lived in a purposive relationship to values. It's seeking them in a very concentrated way. Now, what's religious value is...
he just answered the question in less than a minute. Very, very good.
Life lived in purposive relationship to the supreme value, the summum bonum, to the source of good.
He does use too much Latin. He does it all the time. Now, John does it sometimes, but when John uses Latin, it's in the academy. When Bishop Barron uses Latin, it's from Rome.
Goodness, truth, and beauty, which is God. And what came to my mind as you were talking, Jordan, was two things from Aquinas. One is probably the most misunderstood and overlooked of his famous 5 arguments is the 4th argument. And it's the most Platonic of the 5. He's usually Aristotelian in form, Aquinas, but number 4 is Platonic. And what he says is, we experience things in the world as more or less true, good, and beautiful. Yeah. So just what I was saying, we notice values, and we also notice them ordered hierarchically. That's truer, that's better, that's more beautiful. Then Thomas says we only can make that calculation in implicit relationship to something we consider highest in goodness, truth, and beauty. And the way it's misunderstood is people think, I guess, there's a tall building, there's a taller building, and boy, there's the tallest building. There must be some absolutely tall building. But he's not talking about something as trivial as that. He's talking about the properties of being, the good, the true, and the beautiful. And being is by its very nature unlimited. So therefore, it's true that we make those calculations, we see those hierarchies only finally in relationship to an unconditioned, if I can use the more modern kind of Kantian language.
See, I don't know that. So if, again, I already sort of graded everybody or ranked everybody on the total performance. Jordan, I think, has so far the best opening statement and Bishop Barron the second best. But I think he started strong. I don't know how often he needs to mention Thomas here, because who's he scoring points with? Now, if you're having a debate among colleagues for whom, you usually don't get into trouble by quoting John Calvin in the Christian Reformed Church or Abram Kuyper or Herman Bavinck. Same, I would imagine, Thomas Aquinas in the Roman Catholic Church. He keeps going back and using that. And so, maybe so here you have a question again of context. Is his primary audience Jordan Peterson, John Vervaeke, and Jonathan Pageau? Or where do we rank in the audience?
Some unconditioned form of goodness, truth, and beauty. That's religious meaning, it seems to me, is to be in purposive relationship to that. The other thing from Aquinas...
And I think there's a little nature-grace dichotomy. That's a big element of Roman Catholicism, and I think in some ways nature-grace sets up. See, Protestantism gets a lot of blame and or credit for modernity, but the Protestant Reformation didn't happen in a vacuum. There had been these micro reformations happening before the Protestant Reformation, and in some ways the nature-grace dichotomy sort of sets us up for that. And there could be whereas Peterson and Pageau and Vervaeke very much want to be post-Descartes and have one system of meaning, I wonder how this fits in, how Barron's answer fits in there.
And I think, Jordan, you and I talked about it last time we were together. I love what you did there because that's an implicit argument for God. It's in the second part of the Summa. From final causality, every time I make an act of the will, I'm seeking a good. I'm seeking a value of some kind. But as you say quite correctly, and that's just like Aquinas, that value nests in a higher value, which nests in a still higher value. And so I can't go on indefinitely. That would make my act of the will incoherent. So I've got to come finally to some summum bonum, some supreme value that's motivating me. That's religious meaning, it seems to me, is now to be in relationship to this most alluring horizon of all desire. Now there's Lonergan again, my Canadian reference. To be in relation to God, Lonergan said, is to want to know everything about everything. So that's the value.
Okay, so he sort of split it, and I think with Lonergan now he's putting it back, he's pulling it back together.
The epistemic value of the truth, but now in its unconditioned form. I want to know everything about everything. We call that in religious language the beatific vision. Or I want not just this particular good. So I'm talking to the three of you now, which I think is a good. But it's nesting, as you say, in a higher good. And a still higher good. And so finally, I want not just this particular good, I want goodness itself. That's a religious relationship. So I guess that's how I'd approach it, maybe piggybacking a bit on what you both said.
I think he started really strong, and I think if he had stuck with this, purposive, I'm going to rephrase it a little bit, purposive pursuit of a value, and of course the highest value, I would have liked to have seen more of a slide rather than sort of a two-step. And I think he started strong. I don't think he finished as strong as he started. But okay, so what do I know about meaning after listening to Bishop Barron talk about it? I got a lot of religious-y things. I got a lot of, again, who's he talking to? I heard about Thomas, and I got some Latin, and beatific vision. That sounds religious-y. And, I go, there's always the conversation about me investments now after the Nigerian Anglicans had their thing in the church here. And I tweeted about that today. So, where does that answer leave us? Okay, now let's get to the icon carver.
Jonathan?
It's interesting because, by the way, thank you for making me last in this stacking up on everything that everybody said.
And again, in all fairness to John Vervaeke, going first for this group, that's really tough. That's really tough.
But I think that what's interesting in what John said in terms of relevance realization and in terms of this hierarchy of values that both Jordan and Bishop Barron brought up.
And so John, he doesn't, unlike Bishop Barron, who sort of had this set term, John is obviously sort of crafting this now. And again, he's had more conversations with John Vervaeke than, I don't know how many conversations he's had off screen with Jordan about these kinds of things, but he obviously is a comfortable conversation partner with John Vervaeke.
The thing that I might add, at least in my perception, is that first of all, this pattern recognition that we engage with and this hierarchy of values and just hierarchies in general, they really are teleological in the way that Bishop Barron said. That is that the reason why we perceive hierarchy is because we're always judging or perceiving or trying to evaluate whether something is good. But the other thing that this does in terms of, so it binds reality together, right? So you're looking at something and you want to evaluate the apple, and this desire makes you see the pattern of the apple because you have to engage with it. You have to relate to it. You have to eat it. So because you have to eat the apple, that's why you see it, and that's why you can perceive it, and that's why you're evaluating it. But this pattern, let's say, of binding, of religio that John mentioned, it stacks up. So until now, we've actually talked mostly about individual relationship, this individual relationship with the field of being that presents itself to us, the individual relationship with the ultimate good. But it also does something else, is that it stacks up people together. It binds us together as well. And that's in terms of meaning of religio in a
Now, he's talking much more about what meaning does rather than what meaning is. And he's sort of building on the comments that have gone before, which is fine. But again, I think my ranking in terms of their opening statements, I would give Peterson the best opening statement, maybe Bishop Barron the second, and I think Jonathan probably the third, just because more of the things that he's talking about would be more commonly accessible. And
broader sense, that can also kind of help you understand religious practice, why we get together, why we sing together, why we celebrate, as John mentioned. Why do we celebrate together? Because when you see the apple and you see a good apple, you're implicitly celebrating it. Every act of recognition of a good is going to be a mini celebration, but that stacks up together in terms of people gathering and singing and processing and doing all the things we do in order to celebrate the highest good. And
let me just intersperse something there.
so it's also interesting how often Peterson interrupts Jonathan Pageau. And just in the other video, the Symbolic World video, he interrupted Jonathan a lot. And I would have liked to have seen Jonathan been able to land the plane there.
There, from a psychological perspective, well, that idea of the mini celebration. So there's a technical reason for that in some sense. So let's say you specify a goal, and that goal is nested inside the value hierarchy that we've already.
Okay, now notice Peterson takes something that's colloquial, and then he attaches it to something that's technical. And for, again, given our current cultural context, for many especially many men who tend to like things, they have their preference for, in terms of their job, for things rather than people. So again, the techne, the technical, this is just a quintessential Jordan Peterson move.
Already described. And so now you're pursuing something of value. If you see something that leads you down the pathway to that value, that produces positive emotion, technically.
Okay, now what he did right there was really beautiful, because he connected Bishop Barron's speech with Pageau. Pageau was much more moving towards meaning is not something, and I would have liked to have seen at least one of them talk about, is meaning an emotion? Does meaning have more of an ontological reality that we participate in? I would have loved to have seen more than that. But what Peterson did right there was sort of grab the speeches together and, okay, we're going down the road. But poor Jonathan really didn't get a chance to finish. But Jordan now sees the ball and he's running with it, or he sees the puck and he's skating down the ice.
Speaking, that's dopaminergically mediated. And so there's
And again, there's credibility with that medical talk. You might not be able to say what dopamine does, but no, that's one of these chemicals in the brain that's important. And now if I have a picture of chemicals causing things, this is the real thing that Jordan is doing, is connecting these worlds.
Psychological, there's a fundamental to doing something of value. If you see something that leads you down the pathway to that value, that produces positive emotion, technically speaking. That's dopaminergically mediated. And so there's a fundamental neuroscientific reality underneath the idea that to perceive something good in relationship to a higher good is a celebration. And it is definitely that imbues our life with a sense of positive meaning. And I mean that directly, like meaning.
And again, watching Peter, this is the old Peterson. This is Jordan. This is what he does. Notice the intensity, the urgency. It's all right there, and it brings us in with him. And it's the technological, and it's the medical, and it's the brain chemistry, and it's the out there in the world. And we're gonna very quickly pull all of this together.
Meaning is derived from this nested hierarchy, and then the perception of valued, the perceptions of values that lead us down that pathway. Without that, there is no positive emotion in my understanding of it.
Yeah.
So,
and so the last
Okay, so now Jonathan gets to finish, hopefully.
thing I might want to say is that, so in the same way that the world reveals itself to us as this hierarchy of the good, in the same way that we see that, it also reveals itself to us cosmically. That's why I'm saying it stacks up. And that's why there are temples. That's why there's the law of Moses that was received on the top of the mountain.
Okay, now we're getting into illustrations. And so now, oh yeah, I know what the law of oh, temples. Yeah, those are interesting. So now, we're getting less abstract and we're getting more concrete, and he's drawing the relationships in.
That there is a cosmic revelation of the same pattern that you encounter as an individual, which is inescapable as an individual. And so that is what ends up creating these revelations of being into the world and binding us together as a body instead of just these disparate individuals. And as Jordan said, it's very appropriate to discuss, what are these revelations and what do they look like? And of these revelations, which is the one that binds the most reality together into itself? And I think that is when the image of Christ as being God-man, as going all the way down into death, as reaching to the highest summit, as we could, I don't want to go into his story too much, but Jordan, that there's most of Christ's story seems to go to the limit of storytelling in all the aspects in which it goes, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we've sort of lost the thread on, this is connected with meaning, but, we're following along. And again, Jonathan also has an intensity here, and he's being fairly concrete, which is helpful. Now, when I finally stop it at basically the end of the opening statements, you should ask yourself, we'll get there when we get there.
It's like Christ doesn't just go down into the underworld and resurrect. When he comes back up, the underworld is empty and death is defeated, and that's the end. And so it's like that for almost every aspect of Christ's story, where he reaches the limit of storytelling. And so in that way, it ends up just being the fact that we recognize it, that we've brought it together, that we've celebrated it, means that it is part of this kind of cosmic revelation. And it's something that we can look at objectively and talk about and discuss. But it's definitely there in our story as Europeans, as Westerners, and we've discounted it completely. But I think we're at a point now with this meaning crisis where we can go back and reevaluate it and understand it as the possibility of these relevance realization patterns stacking up beyond the individual, let's say.
Okay, so those are the 4 statements. We're 25 minutes in. Ask yourself which of the opening statements, who of these individuals gave you a better handle on what meaning is and how it relates to religion. And of the 4, if I had to put it into a nutshell, Bishop Barron's sticks: purposive pursuit of a value. That's really good. It's a really nice little handle, very succinct. I can remember it. If you have to ask me about John Vervaeke, I would leverage all of the conversation and listening that I've done with John Vervaeke. Peterson, I remember the connection to brain chemistry. Peterson will often bring in brain chemistry and sciencey stuff, and then find a way to connect it to everyday phenomenological life and then to religion. That's his strength. So I think Peterson had the best in terms of engagement. I was able to stay with him most of the time, and I had a sense of excitement listening to him. I'm just getting spam calls right and left. Bishop Barron, again, probably delivered in that he gave me a definition that I think that's a good definition, and it's something I can remember. And I'll probably, if you'd ask me tomorrow, do you remember that definition that Bishop Barron gave? I'll probably be able to say, yeah. And I'll remember purposive was a good word. Pursuit, yeah. Value, yeah. 3 things, easy to remember. And then, Latin, Aquinas, Transcendentals. And now if I were to listen to it again, I would get more out of it. And then of course, Jonathan trying to bring it and say, well, not just individual, but communal. This holds the community together. Didn't mention the word meaning much, so didn't really tie it in. And of course, John Vervaeke's, all of the stuff that I know from Vervaeke's. But if I listened to this the first time, I'm not sure what I would have remembered from John if he had just started talking about the meaning crisis and the symptomology of the meaning crisis, and then a few examples of that symptomology, and then maybe finding some stories to connect the individual suffering from the symptomology of the meaning crisis to broader things in terms of the meaning crisis. And again, I've come up with my own ideas about the meaning crisis. But there. Okay, so 25 minutes in, end of the opening statements. Where are we going to go next?
Okay, so I want to comment on that revelation idea. I'm going to go a little sideways here. And so you might say that the standard view of the world now is that there's an objective reality that's devoid, that's made out of material things. That's the most appropriate way to conceptualize it. It's made out of objective things. They exist independent.
Remember, beginning of maps of meaning. There are two ways to conceptualize the world: a space of objects or a form for action. That's how he starts Maps of Meaning, 1999, published in 99. He's still working this.
Independently of consciousness, and we project a value structure onto them. And
so in other words, values they're something that we're cooking up, but they're not real in the way that the cell phone stand. You guys haven't seen this for a while. I mean, those of you who remember the cell phone stand as an illustration, you've been around a while. Values are not real like the cell phone stand. You go all the way back to Jordan's conversation with Sam Harris. Big debate about that. Which one is more real? What do we mean by real?
Independently of consciousness, things, that's the most appropriate way to conceptualize it. Void that's made out of material things, that's the most appropriate way to conceptualize it. It's made out of objective things. They exist independently of consciousness, and we project a value structure onto them.
That existing independently of consciousness, again, go back to Jonathan Pageau's symbolic world genesis on there, because what Pageau really does is put the subject first and things second, whereas in terms of order, materialism puts things first and subjects second. Subjects are the product of things. Your consciousness is the product of materiality. That's going to be addressed later in this conversation.
And when we die, let's say, or when there is no human consciousness, that value structure there's no value structure like that there. And so it's epiphenomenal and evanescent. It's not a fundamental part of objective reality outside of subjectivity. So
in the first biblical series, someone asked him the question, if all humans were to go away, what goes with it? And Peterson basically says, well, materialism says values go away when we go away. Values are subsidiary to us. And in some ways, that's, the vaunted evolutionary psychology is all about the assumption that values are produced by us. They aren't out there apart from us as a part of the world. That's what he just basically said.
So now there's a couple of problems with that viewpoint, I would say. First of all, it isn't obvious to me that we see objects, we see patterns. It's not
and now it's really important to notice what he did right there, because we see patterns. How are you using the word see? What is the seeing we are primarily doing? Jesus says eyes to see. Well, our eyes are seeing things, but if someone isn't getting the idea we're trying to communicate to them, we're saying, you don't see it. No, I see the cell phone stand. What do we see? Obstacles and opportunities. We see value. Well, what does that mean? He's not meaning that physically. He's meaning that personally, relationally. The thing that makes us act, it's pragmatist, the thing that makes us act are values. If you have a hierarchy, values are higher than objects. Values rule over us more than objects rule over us. Objects only rule over us to the degree that we see the value in them.
Obvious that is not. Now, there's a couple of problems with that viewpoint, I would say. First of all, it isn't obvious to me that we see objects, we see patterns. It's not obvious that we see. You could make a strong case, and this was made by a man who wrote Ecological Approach to Visual Perception, that what we perceive first and foremost aren't objects. We perceive meaning. Mm-hmm. We perceive a falling off place if we get too near a cliff. And
I've used this illustration before. My office is a mess. And if you visit me here, people are always like, oh, where do you make your videos? And I show them this tiny little corner of my office, and the rest of the office is this horrendous mess. If I were to open the door and there would be a king cobra or a Bengal tiger or a ticking time bomb in my office, I would react to those things before I would see them as objects. I wouldn't even know why I jumped back. We have that all the time. I wouldn't know why I jumped back, but I do jump back, and before I see it. That's his point.
We perceive a falling off place if we get too near a cliff, and even a 6-month-old will perceive that. Children, infants, very, very young, perceive beauty, they perceive symmetry, they perceive value, and so we don't perceive the object and obviously project the meaning. You can't say that that's the way the neuroscience of perception has laid out the world. And then the last thing is that the problem with the idea that we merely project meaning onto a meaningless objective world is that meaning is disclosed to us in ways that we can't predict and that are outside.
Now, that word disclosed, he obviously used that very intentionally. Disclosed implies another agent or agency that reveals something to us. Disclosed is this. So something is moving the curtain back.
Side of meaning onto a meaningless objective world is that meaning is disclosed to us in ways that we can't predict and that are outside of our what would outside of it the new knowledge that we don't have can be revealed to us through the perception of value. It's not obvious how we can project that and then also have something.
Okay, you got to slow that down. New knowledge can be revealed to us, and that's going to get. New knowledge can be revealed to us in the perception of value. Okay, that's not objects. It's knowledge. It's the basis for which we operate in the world. Is revealed to us through the perception of values.
New knowledge that we don't have can be revealed to us through the perception of value. It's not obvious how we can project that and then also have something new revealed at the same time. So meaning is disclosed to us. And the phenomenological psychologists made much of this in the first third of the 20th century, following Heidegger. So anyways, I'm going to leave it at that.
Can I just jump in? I go back here to Dietrich von Hildebrand's famous distinction between the merely subjectively satisfying and the objectively valuable. And I mean, he certainly understood the play between the subjective and the objective, and all the classical philosophers knew that. Aquinas certainly knew it. I mean, if the mind and the intelligible form light up each other, he said. I mean, each one illumines the other. So I don't think the pre-modern people had the sense of, sharp demarcation of the two. Nevertheless, there's a distinction. I think, Jordan, you're hitting at it there. We feel the distinction between the merely subjectively satisfying and the objectively valuable. The objectively valuable addresses me. It rearranges me. It's not something that I've configured or I've projected. it's turned me upside down. I think we've all had that experience. There was an article in Rolling Stone years ago, and it asked a number of the famous rock.
And no, he's a philosopher, and he's, as I've mentioned before, I mean, he's a serious philosopher. He's written serious philosophical books. Now, the question of philosophy, we're going to get to that quite a bit later. But again, he just laid down a lot of philosophical terms, but now he's going to turn and he's going to use an illustration. And this is what preachers do.
Rock and rollers. What was the first song that rocked your world? And I remember liking the formulation of that question, because it didn't say what's the first song you liked. It was the first song that changed you, that rearranged your consciousness. And I can name that very clearly in my own case, was Bob Dylan's Like a Rolling Stone. It wasn't the first song I liked, but it was the first song that rocked my world and rearranged me. And I think that's what real value is like. Now, bring it to the religious level.
Okay, so real value, to sum up, so he had, objective and subjective, and he's dealing with that question that I said I'd really like them to ask, is meaning a feeling? And so now we're getting into value. So is value a feeling? No, because value is something that moves us. And so in terms of trying to rehabilitate and understand again the word spiritual, value is something that we are subject to. Now, our subjection and our slavery to value, and we ought not to be slaves to value, but we ought to submit to value, certain values, and not submit to other values, et cetera, et cetera. So what we're talking about is understanding working hard not to use that word objective, because I think the word has to be set on a shelf for 100 years or so. Value is real enough that it moves us. Value is real enough that we submit to it. Value is real enough that it is more real than we are.
Now we're in a biblical kind of framework where, it's level. Now we're in a biblical kind of is like. Now bring it to the religious level. Now we're in a biblical kind of framework where, it's not you who've chosen me, it's I who've chosen you. And now when the summum bonum isn't just dumbly out there waiting for us to rise up through some contemplative exercise. Because, the summum bonum, Plato and Plotinus and Kant could all say.
You said it once, you probably could have said greatest good a couple of times, and that would have helped.
Yeah, there's a summum bonum. But when it really gets interesting to me is when the summum bonum is after me. The summum bonum is trying to find me and is breaking into my reluctant and recalcitrant consciousness. And now you're talking about religious revelation. But it has to do with that stunning objectivity, the good. Think of like Iris Murdoch there. She was so strong on that theme, that the good confronts us and it changes us and it doesn't let us go. And religious revelation is the sort of ultimate expression of that, it seems to me.
Now, if we talk about agent and arena, and of course, those of you who have listened to enough of my videos know about my God number one, God number two. God number one is the arenic God. God number two is the agentic God. Now, these are not two different gods, but these are dualities that we see to one degree or another by virtue of how consciousness works. Is value? So we can get into John Vervaeke's transjective. Value, sort of like meaning, certainly has often a transjective quality. I've often noticed I am not a drinker. When people find out that I'm not a drinker, then at some point they get to know me enough. They're like, "Is there a reason you're not a drinker? Are you a friend of Bill? What, Clinton? No. I'm not an alcoholic either. I'm just not a drinker." But I know a lot of alcoholics, and for them, walking through a bar or even just the alcohol aisle at some points in their life may be a very difficult thing. There's a value going on there. Is that agentic? Is it arenic? But now what Bishop Barron did nicely was we're there's a nice little conversation about personification versus personalizing. But value has an agency to it that moves us. Anyway, so Vervaeke's going to answer.
This is something with which I'm in significant agreement, but I think it's also important to wonder together why this has become so problematic. I think we're in a meaning crisis. So,
yeah.
And I think we should remember, the factor. So Bishop, you invoked Aristotle's conformity theory, and of course that was replaced by a representational theory of knowledge, a propositional representational theory, for various reasons. One was trying to account for the Copernican revolution, etc. We had nominalism that said those patterns aren't out in the world, and that's why I keep saying Jonathan is more radical than he sometimes realizes, because he's challenging a fundamental nominalism in his work.
Yeah.
Kant is the culmination of that. The real patterns are only in your mind, and we have no access to the world, and there's reasons why we got there. And
so John nicely gives us a little history of philosophy and nominalism. As he just said, nominalism says that, sort of going back to what Peterson said before in terms of the values or what we project onto the world, that's deeply connected with nominalism, that the values aren't there in the world, that we recognize, that we participate in, that we submit to. Values are what we project onto the world. The alcohol in the wine aisle doesn't have any value. We project value onto the alcohol because of our neediness to it. There's no inherent good that the wine would have. And now I can pull Isaiah 5 in, and the parable of the vineyard, all of the New Testament. Wine is this image in the Bible of glory. Well, the glory is all put onto those things. It's not actually out there. And again, John Vervaeke might say, no, it's between. So then, is it arenic? Is it agentic?
And then, of course, there are related issues around ideas of levels of being, which is, I think you're right. All of you have said this, and this is, central to the phenomenology of intelligibility, but it seems to be, contradicted by something that, starts with Scotus and goes through Occam and goes into the heart of the scientific revolution. Is there's no such thing as levels. This is not reality just is, existence isn't a predicate, and those kinds of things. Now, I'm not mentioning these things to espouse them. I'm mentioning them to try and indicate there have been very profound philosophical historical developments that have challenged this phenomenology, and that part of the task.
Now, again, Vervaeke's opening comment was weak, but right here, we're seeing why he's such a strong partner in dialogue. He has a tremendous amount, everyone in this conversation has a tremendous amount of knowledge from which to pull from, but he has been practicing relevance realization here, and what he's done in short order is, and I know it was fairly technical, but has sort of laid the landscape for the history quite briefly, and will now turn and make his point.
Sorry, I don't want to be presumptuous. Part of what I see my task of being is to try and take the very best of science and answer all of those challenges in a way that restores confidence in the hierarchies of intelligibility and the phenomenology of connectedness. That's one thing I'd want to say. The second thing.
Now, why are you doing that? Why are you called to do that, John? Do you think?
Well, I'm called to do that.
Calling. Ooh, now we've got something more than a value that is pulling things out of us and summoning us. And of course, you use this language, and Jordan's going to be right there on it. And of course, Jordan and John have enough of a relationship, and they're, I think, as you can see in this video, their relationship is growing, because at the last conversation that they had online, Jordan's kind of surprised about all the Christian stuff that's coming coming out of John, because John was the guy who taught the class Buddhism and cognitive science. And now suddenly John's talking all this Christian stuff, and Jordan's going to go after that a little while. And again, part of this is the fun of Jordan, because there's sort of a respectability. We all don't know each other, especially John and Jonathan has had some interaction with Word on Fire, and he's written for them, but John hasn't had much. So there's tentativeness there. Jordan's just going to dive in, and it's something winsome about that, at least for me. I'm an interrupter, so if I wasn't an interrupter, I certainly wouldn't be making these videos where it's a constant interruption.
Because
Why?
that's one thing I'd want to say. The second thing,
Now, why are you doing that? Why are you called to do that, John? Do you think?
well, I'm called to do that because, well, this is how I put it to my students who take my introduction to cognitive science. We have a scientific worldview in which science and the scientists and their meaning making have no proper ontological place. We are the whole. Science and we are the black hole within this.
Okay, now John's coming out of his shell. Now he's speaking from the heart. We're hearing his calling. We're hearing his passion. The room has been set. Everybody's getting a little bit more comfortable with each other. And now John is really going to start to, Jordan's pulled it out, and John's say, hey, wait a minute. This is something that matters. This is something I care about.
The scientists and their meaning making have no proper ontological place. We are the whole. Science and
of course, Pageau is smiling here, because Pageau is like, they have no place to stand. That's what he keeps saying, and that's what he said on the symbolic world. That's what he said to rationality rules. That's what he said to Adam. You have no place to stand. There's no framework from which you can account. Your entire effort, this foundationalism, has been accounting for things, but you can't account for yourself. You demand that everyone else come to account. You can't account for yourself. Oh, science.
And we are the black hole within this worldview.
Okay, there's the meaning crisis. And if he had started, okay, I believe we have a meaning crisis. What is this meaning crisis? We are a black hole in the middle of this worldview. And we used to be the black hole out of which we imagined we saw everything. And now we looked in the mirror and we realized we are the black hole ourselves. That this is tied to, and there you've got a central image. Now everything else flows out from it. That would have been a powerful opening statement.
That dominates us. And let's be very clear, and this is Heidegger's point. Domination is not just ideational or even ideological. It is woven into the fabric of our technology, the ways we communicate. It's woven into our cognitive grammar. We talk about, like, even the way that we divide subjective and objective. One of Gibson's points, right, Jordan, you mentioned Gibson, is the notion of an affordance, and an affordance is not proper.
I don't know who Gibson is. So, I don't even have the first name to look it up. Then you'll tell me in the comments section.
Objective, Jordan, you mentioned Gibson, is the notion of an affordance, and an affordance is not properly objective or subjective. The graspability of this cup is not a feature of the cup. It's not a subjective feature of me. It's a real relation between me. And so, I mean, Gibson's work is really profound. This is why it gets taken up into 40 cognitive science. He's trying to challenge this grammar. And there's a whole bunch of us. I'm in no way a singular individual, although I might be a bizarre one. But I mean, I represent a lot of people who are feeling.
John, you're not the strangest one in the room here today. Trust me.
Called to the fact that this lack of ontological placement and the fact how the way it ramifies through, our ontological technological structure and our cultural cognitive grammar, the very ways we think, is causing massive suffering.
So
yes,
I'm
absolutely right.
I'm unclear about that a bit. I'm still unclear about exactly what you mean.
And see, he grabbed the bishop, and he had Jonathan Pageau. I mean, I would have liked to seen that can. I'd like to pull that can out for the opening statement.
What is this black hole? Is this the insistence on the absolute distinction between the subjective and the objective?
No.
Like, what is this black? Okay, so what is?
Well, what I meant, I mean, it's related to that, but what I was directly referring to at the black hole is that does science exist? Okay, if it is, what kind of entity is it? And tell me, using physics or chemistry or even biology, use just that ontology and those methodology. Tell me what science is, and tell me how it has the status to make the claims it does. And tell me how science is related to meaning and truth, and how do meaning and truth fit into the scientific worldview? They're presupposed by that worldview, but they have no proper place within it. That's what I mean. So whenever we're doing the science and saying this is what the world is, we are absenting ourselves from it. We have no home in which we are properly situated. And I think that ramifies through everything we think, say, and do to each other and with each other in a profoundly corrosive way. That's what I mean by the meaning.
Okay,
Okay, you see Pageau smiling there? He's singing Pageau's song. He's making his points for him.
Profoundly
it's caused enormous suffering.
Corrosive way. That's what I mean by the meaning.
Okay, what's the profoundly
It's caused enormous suffering.
It causes enormous suffering. So
yeah, he's got their attention. They're in.
I mean, I was talking to somebody just the other day in Australia, and there are more deaths by suicide in Australia right now than COVID.
Yeah.
And Australia is
Absolutely.
one of the epitomes of, the best countries in the world, affluent, liberal democracy, not much conflict, been at peace for a long time, blah, 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 blah. All the things that the Enlightenment said would bring in unending happiness. And what you have is spiking in suicide. You have the loneliness epidemic. You have the addiction epidemic. You have people choosing to live in a virtual world rather than the real world. You have all of these things that are pointing to the fact that there's a significant stressor. You have positive responses too. You have the mindfulness revolution. You have the resuscitation of ancient wisdom philosophies like Stoicism. You have you have the work of people like right here. I mean, one of the things, and I hope Jonathan takes this as a compliment because he knows that how highly I think of him. I think one of the things that Jonathan is doing with his work is responding to this suffering and the meaning crisis. We were drawn to each other because we both saw the zombie as a mythological representation. The culture was saying to itself, we're suffering a meaning crisis. I'm talking too much. I'm going to stop. But
this is his best talking. And this is when he energized the room. Again, this, in terms of the opening statement, he didn't start strong, but very, very quickly is making his points, is getting people on his side. Things are going well.
If we go back to the image that you use, which is the idea that we project meaning on an objective world, already you can see the alienation that is bound up in that very proposition, which is, okay, so where are we then? We're not in the world. We're like these kind of ghosts that are floating above reality. Like, and where does that come from? Like, where does that floating intelligence come from that's able to separate itself so completely from the world that it's able to just analyze it objectively and then project and then realize that.
Okay, that's what I call the monarchical vision.
Realize that it's projecting subjective meaning on top of it. And so once I think that some of the work that John's been doing and some of the work that you've been doing is to realize this embodied reality is that we are in the world and we are part and parcel of the manner in which meaning, even the world itself, discloses itself. People who think they can imagine a world outside of human consciousness, like where are they? Where are these signs? Where are they standing that they can tell us that we are projecting meaning onto the world? Are they like gods, up in the world? They would never say that. They've taken themselves out of the equation.
And again, this is the monarchical vision. This is what Pageau, what he says, rationality rules. Adam Friended says to them, where are you standing? And the thing is, we're so accustomed to making this move of the monarchical vision that I'm outside the world and I'm looking down on it. And part of the meaning crisis is realizing we can only sort of levitate up and look down if we're a ghost. Because when we levitate up and we look down, we forget ourselves and we act like we don't have these filters and we don't have these biases, which again, if you look at the video I made about the prolegomena, You Latin people, prolegomenon. He might be right, but I'm a creature of habit. The basis of Pageau's business is he flips this around and says, we're going to start with the subject. We're not going to start at some pre-human point back in time and try and roll forward and in that way try to account for what we are. And thereby, once we account for what we are, we quickly make this move and we self-transcend, and then we try to manage the world like a puppet on a string. No, we're not going to do that game because we can't do it. And there's just a lot of lying that goes on in that. So let's understand that in many ways, it begins with us. Now, does it begin with us? Doesn't it begin with us? There's the conversation. But and notice how much energy has come into this conversation now.
So coming back into reality and understanding this image of communion, for example, like a lot of the images that John is saying is really this image of communion, is that meaning is relational, that it's communal, that it's all these things that can help us even understand once again what the religious patterns are for, is to just hold, it's actually holding reality together. And once we've broken that, then we get this increasing alienation, we get the increasing fragmentation, the suburbs as just a spread of people that don't know each other. They don't have common projects, that have nothing in common except that they're living in.
Okay, now what's Pageau doing? He's taken all this abstraction and he's saying, well, now we see the manifestation of this meaning crisis in even the architecture of post-World War II cities.
In just this equal space. And so this kind of reducing of hierarchy in the world that the scientists wanted to happen, it's happened now to us. And everything's breaking apart and nobody can hear.
There's the meaning crisis. It's right there. What we have done to the world has been done to us. We did it to the world in order to have this power. Peterson talks about that in the transliminal interviews. We shut one eye. That's one way that I talk about it often. It's the scientific lab leak. That's another way I talk about it. And we caught the bug. We leaked it from the lab, and then we caught it, and we had a meaning crisis because I don't know if there's a there inside of me. I have deconstructed all other agencies, and now mine has been deconstructed. And what have I left? It's the whole show, as C.S. Lewis begins in his book Miracles.
Hear each other, and it's a direct consequence of that thinking.
Yeah, there's a lot that's just stimulating my thinking here. And one is, God, I love the sciences, but I hate scientism. And scientism is all over.
And that's an apt point, and this is where I grade him so lowly. I mean, everybody's into it. Bishop Barron, come on, jump in. The water's fine. It's a fine point about scientism, but again, it's not often anyway.
The place in our culture. I deal with it all the time in my evangelical work, hearing from not just younger people, from everybody in our culture, that science is the criterion. I saw a video, Jonathan, you and Jordan were talking to Brett Weinstein, and it was about, I don't know, maybe it's something along these lines. But he made very articulately, intelligently, but made the argument that the sciences, the physical sciences, belong in the supreme position vis-a-vis all forms of human knowing. And I'm sure.
And Pageau's like, I'm still waiting to finish that conversation with Brett because he made that move and I called him on it and he was a weenie about it.
Shouting at the screen, no, that's exactly where they don't belong. And that's a form of scientism. The medievals called theology like the queen of the sciences. Well, at least that's more appropriate. You're talking about God and the summum bonum having some kind of supremacy. I also go right back to the classical world. The sciences, from a Platonic standpoint, they're terrific, but you're just getting ever more precise accounts of the cave, right? Of the images, the fleeting, evanescent images of the world, to rise to higher forms of consciousness by way of mathematics, first of all, then to the higher forms of philosophy and metaphysics. Aristotle, moving from physics to mathematics to metaphysics. it's not to denigrate for a second the sciences. Aristotle is the founder in many ways of physics. But it is to say there's a hierarchy again. There's an epistemic hierarchy, and science, physical science, does not belong at the top of it. When it does, something goes really wrong with the human spirit, and there's a starvation of the spirit.
Well, and it's hard to know how to take that seriously. Like, let's say that's a fact. There's a starvation of the human spirit. That's a fact. Well, is it a fact like a fact that emerges from physics? Well, not exactly. It's a different kind of fact. But what happens if we ignore it? Well, people suffer and die. And we don't use the fact that in the absence of a proposition, people suffer and die as an index of its truth. Not from a scientific perspective, that isn't the methodology of science. But that leaves us with this problem of meaning. It's sort of delivered to us, and it isn't obvious to me that science can address it at all. I mean, Sam Harris and other thinkers like Harris have tried to put the value, to bring the domain of value within the domain of science. I think it's an effort that's doomed to failure, because I don't think they're of the same type. I think that science by its very nature excludes, it does everything it can to exclude.
And that's Wilfrid Sellers, the manifest image versus the scientific image.
Value, except, John, it leaves us with the problem you described, which is the problem that Jung addressed when he was tying the development of empirical science back to alchemy, because, and this goes back to the idea of the hierarchies that we started out with. You know, Jung believed that he was really curious about why people ever became motivated to take things apart like scientists did, to concentrate on the minute like that.
Now, this is a part of the conversation I was very interested in, because Peterson has made this point again and again and again. Part of the weakness of the way Jordan has gone about the first and second wave is that some of these things, it's not very easy to check. People will criticize them in other videos. People will doubt them. But it's better in a context like this, where now there's a degree of trust. Everybody knows we're talking in good faith here. We're looking to grow together. We can check each other. We can work on things. And so this is an idea that he's brought out many times, and I've always wondered about it, and I don't have the competency to evaluate it. And so with Bishop Barron, with John Vervaeke, with Jonathan Pageau, you know, I'm looking for it, and there's going to be some evaluation of this idea.
Dream drove them? What fantasies drove them? And for Jung, he found that fantasy in the thousands of years of work on alchemy. And the alchemical notion was there exists a substance, which eventually became a material substance, whose discovery would grant upon its bearer immortality, perfect health, and endless wealth. So the idea...
Now that, as you just said it, is a really powerful image that sort of typifies, and I see why this idea grabs Jordan with respect to this conversation, because that is how we're acting in a materialist age. If I can only buy this one thing, if I can possess this one thing, it's almost an application of Jesus' pearl at great price. If I can possess this one thing, then it's like this moment of ecstasy and fullness and euphoria, and kingdom come will come right there, right now, at the possession of this thing.
Dream was that substance could be found in the material world. And that was a deep, deep unconscious fantasy manifested in all sorts of images, all sorts of bizarre images that Jung had the genius to be able to analyze and understand. He saw that as the dream that preceded the development of science in Western culture. It took thousands and thousands of years to unfold this dream. And scientists were encapsulated within that dream, whether they knew it or not. And so the prime example would be Newton, who wrote much more on alchemy than he did on physics. And so, John, as scientists, at least from the Jungian perspective, let's say, we're necessarily motivated by a narrative that we don't understand scientifically to engage in the scientific process per se. And we're so deeply possessed by that it guides and moves our perceptions without us as scientists even necessarily having to be aware that we're participating in that narrative. So to your point, the whole enterprise is driven by a dream whose reality can't be encapsulated within the process itself.
And now, apart from the historical point about Jung and alchemy and Newton, boy, it just makes me want to read a good biography of Newton. I don't know if there's I'll have to do a little bit of research on that, as if I need to buy another book. Vervaeke's he's been pushing my book buying button a lot lately. He made a book, he mentioned to Sam a book from Carlyle on Spinoza's religion that just sounded fascinating. So, and I still haven't finished some of the other books I bought because John recommended me. And anyway, so apart from the historical point about Jung and alchemy and Newton, the point he makes here at the end, I think, is really gripping, in that it's exactly the same point that John Vervaeke made, that scientists are moved by something and they never ask, hey, wait a minute, what's moving me?
It's a very strange thing.
I think it's very interesting, that dream and sort of the undercurrents of development. So substance goes back to hypostasis, but of course there's another history of hypostasis, which is into the persons of the Trinity, which is a very different history. And so there's no necessity that you go from hypostasis, the grounding of intelligibility, to materiality. And of course, what happened, right, was also the inversion of matter as pure potential to that which resists and resists. And so, and I think that's part of, again, about how a history of how.
Now, he made two really huge points very, very quickly there.
Of material necessity that you go from hypostasis, the grounding of intelligibility, to materiality. And of course, what happened, right, was also the inversion of matter as pure potential to that which resists.
Matter is pure potential to that which resists.
And yes, and so, and I think that's part of, again, about how a history of how the reason was supplanted by will as the dominant faculty by which humans understood and identified themselves. I would like to say that that's bound up with a couple other strands. I'm not trying to do, and I wish I could do exhaustive history here, but I took 50 hours to do it, so I'm not going to try and do it now. But you also have, like people like Harris and others, you have a deductivism model, right, which is I whatever I can deduce from the science is real. But in the Neoplatonic tradition, you also look at what is presupposed by your sciences, and that is also a proper location for the real. So I have to presuppose, right, the intelligibility of the world in order to do science. I can't use science to establish intelligibility. And then if I'm realistic about my science, which I better be, because that's what scientists seem to be doing, I have to be realistic about this intelligibility. But that's in contradiction to the nominalist presuppositions, the flat ontology. Notice the contradiction. Notice the contradiction in reductionism. So you have this whole tradition that says there are no levels of being, get rid of all that Platonic stuff. But the bottom level is the really real level, and all the levels above it are false. That is exactly symmetrical to the upper level is most real, and everything coming down from it is derivative.
Now, again, he packed a ton into there, so you might want to go back and listen to it a few times to, okay, what's he saying? How is this connected? And basically just flip the script on there are no levels of reality, but science is most real. Well, wait a minute, you just said there are no levels. It's sort of this, what we do when we forget what we said at the beginning of the sentence by the time we get to the end of the sentence.
There's no deep difference, this is part of the point I've made, between an emergentist ontology, it is hierarchical and has levels, and an emanationist, it is hierarchical and have levels.
And so do you think Dawkins' selfish gene is an example of that?
I think the idea that you can explain things in a purely bottom-up fashion, this is part of the alchemical revolution. It was like And I think, and I agree with Jung on this. Maybe my interpretation is slightly different, Jordan. But there was a predominance of emanation, an emanationist ontology coming out of the Neoplatonic tradition, and we needed to rediscover. We need to.
Okay, so let me address that for a second. Drag the Christians in here, because one of the
yeah. Last time Christians got dragged someplace, it didn't end well.
One of the claims that Jung made in his works on alchemy, which are very, very difficult to understand, was that, look, the Christian Revolution took place and spread across what became the Christian cultures and the West, broadly speaking, and there was an offer of salvation, right, of deliverance from suffering, and then. And the hope that Christ would return and the kingdom of heaven would be established on earth, or something to that end. And then thousands of years went by, and the disquiet grew as that wasn't revealed. And the unconscious imagination, looking to find a source of new knowledge that could redress that suffering and lack, started to focus on this this opposite emergent ontology that you described. Said we haven't.
Okay, this is the assertion that Peterson makes again and again, and he articulated a little bit more fully now that this was an unconscious desire, that maybe we go, and if we start from the bottom, we can in fact redeem this world. That's in some ways you can see the attractiveness of that idea. Jonathan Pageau is going to attack it pretty hard in a minute.
Paid sufficient attention to the reality of the material world. Maybe that's what holds the key to the alleviation of our suffering. And so then there's a pull away from the top-down hierarchical structure that Christianity had imposed in some sense, or revealed, to the opposite. And now it's swung way in the other direction. And so...
Could I just say one thing in the defense of the Neoplatonists? Which is, if you read Erigena and Cusa, you get to and Erigena is clear on this. You get a dialectical in the Platonic sense, not the Hegelian sense, in which the emanation and the emergence completely interpenetrate. They're both needed, they interpenetrate each other. And I would argue that what's happening now is people are moving, especially in the philosophy of biology, towards we need bottom up and top down. Jordan, this is rife through all of cognitive psychology, bottom up, top down thinking, right? And that's not just specific to the mind. I think it's now spreading out as, no, this is how we should start to think about it. But I think
Grim Grizz on his channel took a little bit from Kurt Jamungal, if I get his name right. I've spoken with Kurt. Vervaeke has, Peterson has. He's doing a filmmaker thing. He spoke to this guy about what they did was they basically were growing frogs in not a frog-like way. Now, of course, Grim Grizz in his own way said, that looks like a horse. Well, they weren't really growing horses from frog cells. But this point about bottom up and top down, that's an illustration of the point that Vervaeke is making. So the specific Grim Grizz video is frog skin abominations, Kurt and Levin. And Grim does have a Patreon, which he'd like you to know about, and there's been 100 views on this video, but I thought it was actually quite an excellent video, and it basically made the same point that this video is making.
A more proper reading, especially of the later Neoplatonists, points to that heritage within Neoplatonism itself. So it doesn't have to be something necessarily foreign to Christianity, I would at least argue.
No, St. Maximus is clearly a bottom up and top down at the same time. In St. Maximus's cosmology, you have the notion that, these revelations are both a communion of love and also a revelation from above, and that there's absolutely no contradiction between the elements coming together and coagulating in this relationship of love, and it expressing this divine principle or this higher principle which is coming down from above. And in terms of Jung's theory, I mean, I don't want to be picky about it that he kind of imagined this story. alchemy came very much from Islam, by the way. A lot of its development was in the Islamic world. Even the word alchemy is not a Western word. And so I find it a little too simplified to just say Christians were waiting for Jesus and then they created this bottom up science. There's a deeper
that's a pretty swift blow.
kind of transfer to say it's not a Western word. And so I find it a little too simplified to just say Christians were waiting for Jesus and then they created this bottom up science. There's a deeper kind of transformation which happened in the West related to nominalism and to a kind of slow progression towards this separation of heaven and earth. We could call it like this kind of ripping apart of the two sides, which kind of led both to materialism and to all these esoteric things that were going on at the same time, right?
And that's a really helpful point, that it isn't just the materialism, it's a ripping apart, and that led to the estrangement on both ends.
It's not true that materialism was on its own, but there are all these kind of esoteric developments that were manifesting themselves. We have to remember that Descartes spent his whole life trying to become a Rosicrucian. Like these two things it's like a ripping apart of reality that leads into the New Age, into all this kind of neo-spirituality. And Christianity's true message is rather the incarnational one. It's the one that John said. It really is this binding of multiplicity and unity, the binding of the emanation part and this kind of emergent part together. And so, Bishop, sorry, I interrupted you.
No, it's very stimulating stuff. And I would add, the structuring.
And when you almost get the sense that three people are having the conversation and he's part of the audience, but he's not as obnoxious as I am to just butt in. And but again, these three have been working on stuff. They've done a lot of distributed cognition together. And, well, here's Bishop Barron.
Element in the Summa of Aquinas is the so-called exitus reditus, right? All things coming out from God.
And then more Latin and more Aquinas. And you can make the point in a way that some of the rest of us on the other side of the fourth wall might be able to access a little better, even though, in all fairness, I mean, John Vervaeke's tough to understand, and he does drop into Latin sometimes and has his own little words. I mean, dialogos and religio and those things. But there's just you're almost just reinforcing a stereotype here that this is how a bishop would talk. And there's no problem with how a bishop would talk. But in the context of this conversation, I don't know.
Then all things returning to God. And so God makes a world that's good, indeed very good, but not perfect. And part of the drama of salvation, which is in the Bible always cosmic, not just human, not just personal. The drama of salvation is this wonderful process of reditus, the return of all things to God, the coming together from below, if you want, but under the alluring power of God's love. So that's one observation. The second one about the science.
And again, his points are always good. And they're right on target. And again, his opening statement was really strong. But, I'd sort of rather see Brett Sockled in here, another Canadian. But if you need a Catholic, get Brett in there, because Brett will, you almost see Brett showing up in his flannel shirt and, jumping all over the place and getting excited. And that's why I like talking to Brett. I haven't talked to him for a while. Should probably talk to him again.
Sciences. I mean, I agree with, there's an army of scholars that say the condition for the possibility of the physical sciences in the West was Christianity. That is to say, the fundamental assumption that...
Another element, I think, of how he participates in this is we all want to make points for our team, myself included. And part of, when I talk with John, I mean, I'm trying to make points for Christianity. He's got some points against it, and I concede some points against it. And Bishop Barron does too. They'll get to a portion in this video where Bishop Barron, like clergy, like myself, will do a lot of critiquing of our own house. But it's just, I'd like to see the tribal wall come down a little bit more in terms of his participation here. And again, maybe it's just because he's, unlike the other three, he's sort of a fish out of water, whereas, Brett Sockled, I think, would be a fun Canadian in this mix.
that the world is not God. If you divinize the world, you're not going to experiment on it. You're not going to analyze it in this sort of objectivizing way. So the world is not God. It's been created. Therefore, it can be experimented upon. It can be analyzed. But then secondly, as we've all been saying in different...
And I think that's a strong point. Now, how it relates to my God number one and Newton loving God by exploring God with physical sciences, there's a ton of nuance in there. But I thought that point that he made was a very strong one.
Ways. It is radically intelligible, not just in a superficial way, not just in certain parts, but in every nook and cranny, the universe is intelligible. That's a very weird thing the more you think about it. Why should that be the case? And of course, it's coming out, I would argue, of a Christian conception that the world did come forth. The Bible puts it poetically as a great act of speech, meaning it's imbued with intelligibility from an intelligent source. Well, when you bring intelligibility and non-divinity together, you get the rise of the modern sciences. So they're not the least bit repugnant to Christianity. On the contrary, what is repugnant is this scientism.
Before he's going to go on to scientism again, but another aspect of his participation in this is I often get the sense that he's continuing to address most of the stock points in so many of the Christian versus atheist little spats on YouTube. And part of the hope of this little corner of the internet is to get beyond some of that.
And you've all been hinting at it in different ways. Trace it to people like Descartes. But I'm with John. I'd go right back to Duns Scotus and Occam and the breakdown of a...
They were Catholics. Huh? Yeah, but they started Protestantism.
Participation metaphysics. Mm-hmm. And when you get this univocal conception of being and following from that nominalism, and I would even dare say certain forms of Protestantism are very much conditioned by that way of looking at things, you get a lot of the problems we're facing today. I'm for a recovery of the pre-modern, this wonderfully rich pre-modern sense of a participative view of being. The world in God, the world reflecting God, not a world of separated things and God being the supreme thing among them. So Aquinas says that God is not the supreme being.
And if you go to my conversation with John about classical theism and non-theism, we had that conversation after this conversation. If you remember at the beginning of that conversation, John said, I wish this particular Four Horsemen conversation was out so we could talk about it. But we'll get another chance to talk about it, I hope. Lord willing. There's my little Christian saying.
Being. Mm-hmm. He doesn't call him en summum, but he calls him ipsum esse, to be itself. So there's a whole view of reality that's implicit in that description of God.
I once, there was a guy, he was Frisian. We were in the Dominican Republic. We were all living in the guest house. He was a rough Frisian, and he married a woman from The Hague, a very refined lady, and she was there helping the little evangelical library do their thing. And the rough Frisian was helping build benches. The rough Frisian had trouble getting along with the Dominicans. His refined wife had no problem getting along with the Dominicans. And I was staying in the guest house, and he was Frisian, and his wife was Dutch from The Hague, as my friend Tim Blackman says, like the froth. So unknowingly, not knowing anything about anything, I said to him, it's nice you have your wife here. You can speak Dutch with her. And he looks at me and he says, I don't speak Dutch. Dutch is for the preachers and the lawyers. I said, well, what do you speak? I speak English to my wife. Oh, okay, I do too. I don't know any Dutch or Frisian. I just kind of want to tell Bishop Barron, just lay off the Latin a little. I don't speak Latin. Latin is for the bishops and the priests. I speak English. So, all in good fun. I do really love Bishop Barron, and I listen to his video on transubstantiation that Mary Cohen sent me to after I said some inaccurate things on my channel that offended my good Roman Catholic friend Mary Cohen. And she said, listen to Bishop Barron on transubstantiation. I listened. I thought, that's not very different from what I believe. And then, of course, I read Brett Sockel's book, and it's like, oh, my goodness, we've got to do something about this Protestant Reformation. It's kind of, this is a real problem. So anyway, I do love Bishop Barron, but there's a sense that he's not quite, he's not one of the cool kids in this conversation. Like, he's not kind of on the same page as the other three.
God. And that is repugnant to scientism and its very, to be itself. So there's a whole view of reality that's implicit in that description of God. And that is repugnant to scientism in its various forms. And I think that's the key to recovering a lot of sense of religious meaning.
He does know how to stop talking, though, which is something I can't often say for myself. So, and I've said before in my videos, I sometimes watch his videos and think, I wish I were more like Bishop Barron. I wish I had all of those cool words and was self-controlled and, knew how to shave. But I just got to be me. So.
I really liked the invocation of the participatory. Part of what I've been arguing is that the cutting edge cognitive science, what's called 4E cognitive science, is challenging the reduction of knowing to propositional knowing that something is the case. Yeah. That what we're discovering, and you can even find, specific kinds of memory for each one of these. There's also procedural knowing. There's knowing how to do something. There's skills. Yeah. There's perspectival knowing, which is knowing what it's like to
John gets to introduce his 4 Ps.
Be here in this state of mind, in this situation, giving me situational awareness. And then the deepest is participatory knowing. This is the way in which we know by how we are conformed and transformed by others, by the world, so that our knowing of ourself and our knowing of this. So you see this, of course, prototypically in the way you know your beloved. You don't know them by yourself.
Maybe we could get John a better camera. Although most of the videos he doesn't do from this spot, but this camera's just not up to snuff. So I know it costs a little money, but get a Sony. And if you can get a Sony A6400 with a fast lens like this Sigma lens, it's a fairly reasonably priced lens. Or even if you just get a Sony ZV-1, which is a nice little vlogging camera. It's got enough. Really got as many features as the big Sony. It'll do, it'll give you a nice crisp picture, and that'll help.
Your skills or your proposition. Of course, you know them this way, but this is not the essence of it. The essence of it is the way, you are conforming to them and you're being transformed. So your self-knowledge and your knowledge of them are bound together. But this is now becoming these ways of talking about other kinds of knowing, and the way in which they, are stored in different kinds of memory, right? Procedural memory, episodic memory, that weird kind of memory we call the self. This is now coming to the fore. But here's the point I want to make. The point is, right, we've suffered kind of a propositional tyranny from Occam on, where we reduced all of knowing to the propositional. And I would argue that most of what I called religio is being carried on by the procedural and the perspectival and the participatory.
So say we all.
And so that is in a fundamental way how it's not just out there. It's like right in the guts of our self-interpretation.
Yeah.
Again, weak opening statement, but in some of these sections, especially, so I'm going to be ending this pretty quickly because my time I have today to work on this is ending. And then we're going to get into the whole psychedelic thing, which this is the toughest part of the video. The psychedelics kind of carry it for a while, and then we're going to have that conversation again. But then the end of the video really ends strong. But, in some of these parts in the first hour, John really carries the conversation, and he's doing it with passion and conviction. Now, again, it's pretty dense stuff. You have to know a lot to understand what he's talking about, and could have used a few more illustrations in there just to help Jad the alcoholic have any idea what John was saying, or maybe hope to. But again, Chad the alcoholic isn't one of the individuals here. And part of what I tend to do in a lot of these conversations is always sort of say, okay, well, let's pause that and tell me that again in a way that your mother can understand, assuming that your mother isn't also a PhD in cognitive science or psychology or philosophy or something like that. But your mother who loves you and who trusts you, but who would really love to know what you mean when you use these fancy words. So, and I haven't done a lot of that translating for John here because I've done some in other videos. And to really break down all that stuff would extend the length of this. Generally speaking, it's about an hour for... So if to treat an hour of video usually takes about 3 hours for me in something like this. So as long as I don't have too many rabbit trails.
The question, I think one of the questions is what is the ontological significance of that, let's say? I mean, one of the...
Okay, so what is the ontological significance, or what are the implications of this ontologically? Is there... And of course, this is where Jordan Peterson's bleeding edge really is. You know, the point that he always gets to when this is as far as he can push things psychologically. And can we really live into a Christian ontology? Can we get at this? Again, now he's deeply modernist in that he wants it justified. He wants to see the foundations of it, but this of course is his ceiling and what keeps driving him. Now, whether he's making any progress in this, that's a difficult question, but this is where we're at.
What is the ontological significance of that, let's say? I mean, one of the... leaving aside the truth or lack thereof of various religious claims, one of the...
hate to make another camera point, but I always get camera questions. Look at where the camera is focused. It's focused on his mic stand. It's not focused on his face. A Sony camera, right now I'm looking at the little viewfinder of my Sony camera. It's locked right on my face. Now, there's a little switch you can do to have it, but see, wherever I move, it stays focused on my face. So if you really want to up your game, now he's got a great mic and he sounds good, and that's more important than the video. But if you really want to do a video where right here, what Peterson said right there, we look at each other's eyes. It's what we do. So if you really want to have your eyes in focus, no matter what you do, Canons are good too, but I have a Panasonic, can't focus well. Sony, good lens, even just a ZV-1, which has a good lens. It's built into it. It's a little cheaper. It's about $700. Where's my Sony endorsement? Anyway, I distract myself, and I'm sure I'm annoying you.
Weaknesses, I believe, leaving aside the truth or lack thereof of various religious claims, one of the weaknesses, I believe, of the rational atheist's position is that, first of all, their argument is carried out almost entirely in the propositional landscape. Yes. They treat religion as if it's a set of propositions that are in...
And what did Vervaeke say? It's the tyranny of the proposition. I've been talking about this for a long time. It's helpful to understand why we gave over our freedom to the propositional. That was part of the exchange of the scientific lab leak. That it's kind of like Odin giving up an eye. We gave up one eye if you will give us mastery over nature so we can bind her and make her our own and make her do our bidding for us. That's the exchange we made, and now this is the way sin works. Now we are its victim. Now it is our master. And the proposition, it's the tyranny of the proposition. I thought John said that really well.
they treat religion as if it's a set of propositions.
And in all fairness to them, and Bishop Barron later in this conversation will make points that I think are dead on right. He was trained a generation before me. He's, I think, a number of years older than I am, even though I look older, which I guess has its benefits. And as my grandmother would hate the beard, but this tyranny of the propositional was totalizing in theology, biblical studies, all over the place. And by the time I got to seminary in the 80s, it was already starting to wane, in that increasingly our seminary professors and us as students were enamored by much more of a literary approach, because I think the reason we were more enamored by that was the meaning was in it. And I have some of my commentaries back here. They're grammatical, historical, which are of absolutely no use to a preacher, because they sort of strip all the meaning out, and the only meaning left is an authorial intent. And that then gets tricky, especially if you're a Christian and you've got to navigate old and new.
Are in some sense expressed in a manner contrary to the propositions that constitute science. And then I think, well, wait a minute, guys, you're missing the point here. And there's a propositional element to religious claim, and I often think that's the weakest element of. But what do you make of the fact that people have?
Now, if you look at the little video I did, and my wife said I look like one of those old sailor motifs. Sorry, this makes for really bad audio. This video, where I'm in my car. Grim Grizz didn't like the portrait. I should have flipped the camera over. I didn't have a selfie stick with me. I was just in Costco. I would have had a better camera too if I had thought I was going to make a video, so I just had the phone that was with me. But this is part of the point of the psychedelic, that you're not going to get. If you're a thoroughgoing scientistic, you can't get a propositional from a psychedelic. And that's part of the alleviation of the fear that you're opening gateways for other spirits into you, that Christians, at least sufficiently Christians, people who are sufficiently traditional, have. Say, oh, this is just psychology, so I guess no space elves, or I don't know, the DMT, that opens the door. I don't know enough about it, and I'm not going to play with it to find out. And I'm not against the clinical study of it. Clinical study is by definition hazardous to people who subject themselves to it. But this point about the propositional is really important.
Religious experiences. What do you make of that exactly? That's the weakest element of. But what do you make of the fact that people have religious experiences? What do you make of that exactly? Well, you say, well, that's epiphenomenal. It's like, well, yeah, is it really? Like, are you so sure about that?
Okay, so notice before, he noted that the value was epiphenomenal, same word he used. The value is epiphenomenal to the materialist that says it's the objects out there and we're projecting value onto the objects. And notice that's exactly the same move that the materialists are making with respect to religion. Now, the religion is epiphenomenal, and this is what Peterson is questioning. And this is his ceiling. He always goes just up to this line, and Destiny made the same point. Now a number of people have sufficiently said this opening thing that he says.
What Jordan Peterson does is Jordan Peterson makes a lot of descriptive claims, but he never makes any normative claims.
Jordan Peterson's always in trouble for his normative claims. But with this respect, these guys make a really good point.
So Jordan Peterson will say things like, women are not as happy today as they used to be. Women and men don't get along in the office. Men tend to be...
And it's always these issues that they point to, even though this is just a portion of what he talks about. But this, of course, is what fuels his, in a very, I get my fancy Vervaeke words mixed up, in a very agentic, arenic, dynamical situation. That's what fuels Jordan Peterson's status rocket ride.
Be better at this thing. And then that's all he ever says. He never takes a step further to make a prescriptive claim to say, like, what should we do about something?
Peters is the guy who's known for telling people they should clean their room. So don't say never takes a prescriptive claim. That's not true. But with respect to this line that Jordan Peterson is right at here.
And the problem is a lot of people will take the things that he says and then they like jump to very bad places, kind of
very bad places, like becoming religious. It might be so bad that you're a pastor.
Obviously, it's where you would expect someone to go based on what he said, but then he never takes responsibility for any of the...
I'm not going to take responsibility for anything that you do after listening to my words. I should.
The kind of normative leaps people make off of his descriptive ones, and that's kind of the annoying thing with dealing with Jordan Peterson.
And here, Destiny is, as he often is, bang on the money. Jordan doesn't necessarily smuggle bad ideas himself, but he facilitates an environment that makes it incredibly easy for others to do so.
He's an enabler.
He doesn't say that women should fulfill the role of looking after children.
It's always these issues.
But he does clear the path for those who do.
Clears the path.
Given this, the question is, how responsible is Jordan for the damage done by his rhetoric? How much responsibility is on the cross on his back? Truth be told, I don't know. I'd like to know your thoughts, so you can let me know in the comments, but what is for certain is that he bears some responsibility.
Let's get past the culture war stuff.
Jordan Peterson is not a Jesus smuggler, but he is a Jesus smuggler.
That's because he goes right up to the line.
Anyhow, as always...
Talk more about this. You get set 11 minutes and 28 seconds. Not a long video in my book. You could just basically note that Peterson brings people right up to the edge here, and they take the next step right over the doorway into the church, and Jordan still stands at the door. And are we going to go this far?
Let me give you an example. So I talked to Brian Murarescu and Carl Ruck a while back, and they'd be doing some investigation into the Eleusinian mystery.
So I am going to stop this here because I'm really glad that he brought it up, because it was interesting, because Bishop Barron and Jonathan Pageau basically held their peace. I was thinking more about this. Why are churches so against this? Let me give you an illustration. Why is Major League Baseball so against steroids? Why is professional cycling so against, juicing? Why all of the drug testing in professional sports associations? Now, if you're playing in a church softball league, or you're playing in pickup games or some other league, and you want to use performance enhancing drugs, nobody's going to stop you. You'll hit further. You'll do all of that. But what you can't do is construct much more a communal, coherent, cohesive enterprise on these things. And that's why baseball, yeah, you'll roid up, but not everything will hold together. I think that's a helpful example. And that's part of the reason in the church, no, we want you to spend your time in meditation, spend your time in prayer, spend your time in song, spend your time pursuing your spiritual exercises so that you can hit that ball out of the park. But the individual home run is, and I think in the second part, Pageau and Bishop Barron will talk well about this. And I seem to come down pretty much, at least with what Bishop Barron articulated here, I'm with him there. And so that always brings out the interesting comments and personal comments too, because people who know me from the meetup, there are far more people that have experimented with psychedelics than I ever knew before I started this thing. But nothing I have heard has brought me to the point where I would say it's in the interest of the church to promote these as a form of pursuing Christ. That's where I'm at. I think I don't have a problem with Johns Hopkins studying them pharmaceutically. We do lots of things pharmaceutically with lots of different drugs. I think that, at least listening to them, there seems to be some basis for it. But in terms of the church, I want people to hit their home runs after working out in the gym, spending time in the batting cage. So and I know I had a conversation with Sevilla about this. I've had a conversation with a number of people, and I know a number of you tell me, and I don't question you or judge you on this, that you came to Christ and you came to the church as a result of some of your experimentation with psychedelics. You're not going to lose status in my eyes for saying that. But the question that those of us who have, that Bishop Barron and I both have in common, those of us who have positions of authority in the church, do we imagine that the church should promote the use of this as, let's say, an evangelistic tool? I'm not there. I very much doubt Bishop Barron would be there. Jordan is much more curious and open about that than I am. I am skeptical, not that individuals can't have profound, ecstatic, even transformative experiences with them, but that this is a edifying practice for the community to promote and participate in the same way that you can roid up and hit a baseball further, but it's not good for Major League Baseball. It's not good for the Olympics. It's not good for the professional cycling, because what we're trying to do as a community is build up together. So we'll have to talk about more of that when we get into it. So we're 56:43 in. I'm going to pause here because for the next long while, it's going to be about the psychedelics. And actually, for the next half hour, it's a lot of the psychedelic stuff. And I think actually the final half hour of the video is the best half hour. So, well, there you go. This is part one. I hope to do this in 2 parts, Sam and Hank, if you were betting on how many parts this would take. I'm not saying I won't return to it because, again, often I read your comments on these kinds of things. And, I was going back and forth on Twitter with Nate, and I take your input, and my opinions about these things change. And I know a lot of you have sent me messages about psychedelics, and you've not moved me yet. You can continue to send me messages about psychedelics. Again, you won't lose status with me if you tell me that you have taken them. As a pastor, people tell me all kinds of things. And it is, for me, a spiritual discipline to not have people lose status for good faith, heartfelt things that they try or do. It doesn't mean I will change my mind about the moral valence of some of these things or about the functionality or potential of some of these things. But yeah, so it seems to me the psychedelic conversation, we're just at the beginning of it. And maybe Peterson later says this is something the church is going to have to come to terms with. And I think he's right. That's been obvious to me in these 4 years that I've been working on this stuff. But my opinion of it still hasn't changed. And I really don't see myself wavering on it. So, yep, that'll be the next part. But this is good enough for now. So let me know what you think. Like I said, there'll be less video production this week. This is a long one. I was just thinking that if I finish this up tomorrow, if this one is probably 3 hours or so, maybe I will post this one. Today is Tuesday. I will post this one Wednesday morning. And then Thursday, there'll be a little meditation on Thanksgiving, which I'll just basically pull out of. I'm doing a larger little video for the church, my church channel, because we're not having an in-person Thanksgiving service. And then Friday, maybe I'll post the second episode of this. And then Saturday, Lord willing, if I get my rough draft for Sunday, video done tomorrow. Again, my sermon's going to be really rough drafty because they'll do a lot of more thinking between Wednesday and Sunday with respect to what I'll say on Sunday. So Saturday should be the rough draft. If Freddie shows up, we might have a Freddie and Paul show on Sunday. I'll also post my Romans class on Sunday. If you want to watch the Romans class live, you can watch it on the church YouTube channel. We stream it live. Rick helps us with that. There might not be a video on Monday morning because I don't know that I'll have an extra one unless sometime this weekend I grab my camera. But usually if I do a quick take like that, I usually want to post it right away. So that's the way things are going to go. Then Monday, what do I have Monday on my schedule? I have something Monday. I think I have a conversation Monday. I think it's going to be a good one. So we'll see next week. Friday next week, I have to fly in and out of Salt Lake for church business. So yeah, but I try to make enough videos for you. And thanks for watching, and let me know what you think in the comment section.